Hi, so my name's Adam Weymouth. Thanks a lot for having me. This is sort of the first literary festival I've done for quite a while, actually. I was meant to, yeah, it's really nice actually to sort of be given a chance to kind of talk about the book because everything's been so closed down the last year. To tell you a bit about myself, I'm living in Scotland at the moment. I'm living on the west coast of Scotland on a big loch called Loch Fyne. Well, I moved about 6 months ago, and actually, sort of having been interested in salmon for the last few years, I've now sort of come to the kind of centre of salmon in Britain, and I can see a salmon farm right out my window. But I grew up in England. I grew up in the south of England, and moved to London when I was about 18, and got into kind of environmental activism first. That's sort of where the interest around climate change and stuff came from. Started going on a lot of kind of protest marches and stuff like that, and then got more involved in kind of sort of the things that Extinction Rebellion are doing now, kind of civil disobedience kind of stuff. Was working for a group called Plain Stupid for a while, campaigning against airport expansion. Worked on a climate change film called The Age of Stupid that came out about 10 years ago. And but I sort of always wanted to write as well, and I was really missing that kind of activist world is so sort of kind of non-stop and it just really takes up all your time, and I was really missing the writing as well. So I started thinking about ways that I could maybe try and combine the two and sort of do work on the environment and climate change that I was really passionate about, but also go back to writing which is kind of the thing that I'd always wanted to do since I was little. And I also really like traveling because of all the kind of climate change campaigning and these campaigning against airports. But I was really missing traveling, and I did a long walk. I spent a year walking across Europe. I walked from London to Turkey and spent a year doing it. It's kind of like, how can I have an adventure without flying? And I wrote a few travel pieces while I was walking. So that was and managed to get them published in magazines. So that was sort of my way into writing, really. And yeah, and it kind of went from there, and I started doing more environmental work, and then in 2013 I got given a grant from a group called the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, which, if I don't know how old you guys are, but from 18 upwards, they give amazing travel grants to anyone that wants to go and explore things that they're passionate about. So they gave me a grant to go to Alaska for the first time, and I wrote a bunch of stuff about climate change while I was there, and that's when I first came across the story that led to Kings of the Yukon. And Kings of the Yukon I wrote 4 years ago now, so I went back to Alaska 2 years running and did this 4 or 5 month canoe trip down the Yukon, completely unprepared. I'd never really been in a canoe before, and really sort of learned as I went. I spent a few days going down the River Wye on the border of Wales as a little practice, but like compared to the Yukon, which is, enormous, it's sort of 1 or 2 miles across a lot of the time. It was really sort of learning as I went. Yeah, so I came back and wrote the book, and the book came out, and then I've been writing since. Really, it's not been a great time to be a travel writer this year. I've been kind of at home and working on a novel for the last year, which is something I never really thought I'd do, but traveling in our minds at the moment, I suppose. But yeah, thanks very much for having me along. I'm sorry you're not in Hay on Wye, but I hope I can answer some questions anyway.
Do you have any questions off any of that, or do you want to stick to?
No.
Yeah. Menji, do you want to put your mask down and then?
What inspired you to go onto the journey in the first place?
So I suppose it was, yeah, as I said, the first time that I went to Alaska, I got given this grant to go, and I didn't really know what I wanted to write when I was there. And I traveled all over Alaska. I had 3 months there, and I went all over. I went to a place called Point Hope, which is right up in the northwest corner, where there's Inuit people that still hunt whales. It's been a continual village there. They've been there for 6,000 years, and they still go hunting whales in these tiny sealskin boats. They invited me up to their whaling festival. I went to the site of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which was a huge oil tanker that went down in 1989, and where they're still digging a lot of oil out of the beaches, sort of this far on. Just really kind of traveled around the state. And one of the places that I went was out right on the west coast of Alaska. It's quite hard to travel in Alaska. There's hardly any roads apart from in one sort of corner. Everything else is very remote wilderness. And so you get everywhere these tiny little bush planes, which having campaigned on not flying for quite a few years was difficult. But and all the I was going out to see a guy called Mike Williams, who was chief of the Yupik Nation at the time. And he lived in this tiny little village called Akiak, right out on the west coast of Alaska. To get to Akiak, all the planes went through this bigger town called Bethel. And Mike said to me that if you're in Bethel, you might as well go in to see this court case that's going on at the time. And so I went to have a look at what was happening in the courtroom, and ended up watching the entire trial and writing a piece about it. And it was these 23 Yupik fishermen, which are one of the Eskimo groups in Alaska. These 23 fishermen had gone out, the Department of Fish and Game, who's the sort of environmental governing body in Alaska, they put a ban on catching salmon that year because salmon numbers had got so low that they said that they had to stop everyone catching them in order to try and stop them from going extinct, essentially. And these fishermen had gone out to catch them anyway, because they were saying that catching the fish, it wasn't just getting food for them, it was kind of their cultural heritage. It was basically their kind of spiritual practice. They were defending themselves based on the right to practice their religion. And that to me just seemed like such an interesting contrast, like how you've got this one group that's trying to preserve the fish because you want to preserve the species, and you've got this other group that's trying to preserve their culture, really. And is there any way of, so much of climate change and stuff, we think about these, changes that you have to make, but that's also really impacting on people's cultures. And so it just seemed like this really interesting way of telling a story to me that was about saving a fish, but also about saving a people. And so I wrote this article, and then I came back to England, and then I followed the story, and then the salmon numbers were just going down and down. And the next year there was a ban on catching the king salmon for the whole length of the Yukon River, which is a 2,000-mile long river. That's the same distance from Britain to Turkey, same distance that I'd walked for a year. So it just, it seemed to me that there was this much bigger story to be told. And something that I kind of felt was, it's bigger than the story of the salmon. Like, you talk to people about salmon, and people would talk to me about what they hope for their kids and why they choose to live in these mad, out of the way places that they do, and what it means to try and be, indigenous, but also a 21st century American, or like all these really interesting questions it started. So I'd never thought about salmon ever. Like, I don't fish. I'm not a biologist. Like, I'd never really given any consideration to salmon. What kind of drew me in was that story about the people. And then a bit further down the line, I started to realize that they're quite amazing fish as well, actually.
Angie, second.
Were there any points in the journey where you considered quitting?
Well, I'd signed a contract that I had to write the book. So, but actually, it wasn't. Most of it was really nice, like, everyone thinks of Alaska being sort of -40 and really cold, and it obviously is that during the winter. But we were there for summer, so started paddling at the beginning of May and finished at the start of October. And that middle bit of the year, they have beautiful summers. And the sun never sets either, so it's kind of light for sort of 23 hours of the day. The sun hardly goes down at all. And I've been used to doing these kind of really long hikes where I sort of carry everything that I can on my back. And so a canoe is pretty luxurious, actually. You can take everything with you. We had to carry about 6 weeks worth of food with us at a time. But we had enough space to have really nice food, and I had a chair and I had spices, and it was a lot of it was just a really nice way to travel. So no, actually, I really enjoyed the whole length of the journey.
Out of all the experiences during your journey, what would you consider the most valuable one?
Oh, that's a hard question. I suppose the thing I came back thinking was, somewhere like Alaska, it's so easy to see that when the environment changes, people change as well. Climate change there is so obvious. You'd hear these awful stories. For example, these people know the land so well. Like they live on the land. They work on the land. But you'd hear stories of hunters going out on the river in the winter because they thought they knew the ice, and then they just fall through the ice and disappear because they can't trust the ice anymore. You hear stories about villages kind of falling into the sea because this permanently frozen ground that they rest on isn't frozen anymore. And I'd see, like, with the salmon disappearing, how that's changing cultures as well. How sort of teenagers are not really seeing any point in staying in their villages anymore if they can't catch salmon, which means they're moving to the cities, which means they never come home again. And it was so clear that when the environment changes, when the animals change, the people change as well. And I think that's really true for us as well. But because we get our fish in the supermarket and our water comes out the tap, and we don't really see the effects of climate change, it's much easier to think that it's nothing really to do with us. So I suppose I suppose the most profound experience was coming back and realizing that we are really all connected, and that's not just like a sort of nice poetic thing to say. Like, it's really true. We really are part of our environment, and when the environment changes, we change, and the people in Alaska are just kind of the first people to really, really see that.
Your mask.
So you said earlier on that you were involved in a lot of environmental activism. So do you consider yourself to be a naturalist?
I don't know. Like, I suppose by naturalist, I would think of someone that's kind of scientifically trained, and I'm not. I spend a lot of time talking to naturalists and to biologists and people like that. I suppose I see my role as, a lot of those people are doing really amazing work, but they're not very good at communicating it. And they're also meant to kind of not have a political viewpoint a lot of the time. Scientists try and stay away from kind of any sort of political commentary in case that kind of devalues their work or people think it's opinionated. So I suppose I see my job as kind of translating that amazing work that they do. I spoke to a lot of naturalists that are working for salmon going down the river, both kind of sort of Western scientists from our tradition, and also indigenous scientists who have a very different way of looking at the world. And those two groups argue all the time, and so I sort of see my job as kind of being in the middle and trying to communicate that, you guys are never going to sit down and read a salmon naturalist, probably. I wouldn't if I wasn't writing the book. So I kind of see my job as sort of bringing that information to people, I suppose, in a kind of captivating way.
And who would you consider to be your inspiration when you write books?
I think I'm inspired. And part of my reason of wanting to write about Alaska was because I was always inspired by these kind of big American writers. I saw when I was speaking to Nathan just now that you've got a poster of Jack Kerouac on the wall behind you, who was one of my massive inspirations growing up and made me want to travel America and cross America and write about America. And other American writers, Cormac McCarthy, I think is amazing. He writes sort of modern Westerns, I suppose. But the landscape, again, is like very much kind of a character. I read a lot of Jack London growing up, kind of Call of the Wild and White Fang, and it was books like that that probably kind of got me to Alaska in the first place. So mostly fiction, actually. I always thought I was going to write fiction, which is why it's been quite fun to be working on a novel this year when I've not been able to travel. And I really kind of moved into sort of doing the journalism because I couldn't really work out how I was going to do fiction and actually get paid to do it as a job. And since then, it's kind of really opened up. So there are I don't know, nature writers that I really like as well. One of the big inspirations for Kings of the Yukon was a book called The Snow Geese by a guy called William Fiennes, who follows a migration of geese from Texas to the north of Canada, which is an amazing book. But yeah, a lot of it is kind of American fiction writers from the 20th century, I think.
Okay, and you said you enjoyed most of the journey, but what would you consider to be your not so favorite part?
The weather, the bad weather. I suppose. You know, we had lovely weather from sort of like kind of July and August, but towards the end, it just rained all the time. You know, you're getting very close to the Arctic Ocean, and it's kind of the beginning of autumn. The thing that I was really scared about before starting the trip was bears, because you know that's the kind of image of Alaska. I'd just seen a film called The Revenant before I left, which has this horrifying bear attack in it, and Alaskans really like to scare the tourists with these sort of bear stories all the time. You know, it's like what people will tell you in the pub at the end of a night. They're kind of scary bear stories, so it's really hard to forget about bears. And we did have a couple of run-ins with bears on the trip. Where bears came quite close to the camp, and it was like nothing happened. It was absolutely fine, but at the same time, it was terrifying. You know, coming from England or Wales or Scotland, we're not, you know, our biggest carnivore is a badger, and so it's really odd to be somewhere where you are not the top of the food chain. You know, and that's kind of always at the back of your mind. But what actually, yeah, the hard thing was just kind of being wet for a month, just that sort of continual rain, I suppose. And the weather was kind of the most dangerous thing as well. Actually, it wasn't really the bears. You know, the river gets so big towards the end. It's 7 miles across when it gets to the sea. It's absolutely huge. And so when you get a bit of wind, you get really big waves, like almost like being out on the sea. And canoes aren't really designed for waves at all. So a lot of it was we had to be really careful to kind of sitting out that bad weather, and you know, capsizing would have been a really bad thing. So just really making sure that didn't happen, and lots of days kind of sitting on the bank waiting for the weather to blow through.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Would you say that you've always enjoyed writing?
Yeah, I really did. Yeah, I don't even know where it came from, but I think from a very young age, I was always writing short stories. Always thought I was going to be a writer. And then apart from that kind of detour away in my sort of early 20s, when I was doing a lot more of that kind of climate change activism and didn't really have time to write, I guess I have always been writing, yeah. And I suppose that was quite a good lesson, really. I've got a lot of friends that have kind of stayed in that kind of specifically activist world, you know, and still doing a lot of campaigning and like out on the streets and all this kind of stuff. And I really believe in that. But I guess it became important to me to kind of go back and do what I was really passionate about, you know, still kind of focus on that environmental side of things, but to try and, you know, to sort of remember that actually I was really passionate about the writing as well, and to try and come back to that.
What would you say is your favorite part of the outside world?
What my kind of favorite place?
Yeah, like your favorite sort of place.
Oh. I mean, where we're living quite now is pretty special. I suppose that's one thing, you know. I'd always kind of thought of places like Alaska in my mind as being these sort of incredible wildernesses, and living in Britain, it always felt like a kind of very small place by comparison. You know, I spent a lot of my time in London, you know, city of 7 million people. And I thought I had to go somewhere like Alaska to kind of feel a certain sort of feeling about the outside world. You know, and it is amazing to be somewhere like that, and you know, for them not to be a road for 500 miles and to be on these massive rivers and stuff. But actually coming back to Britain, I feel like it is really comparable. You know, I've done some sort of canoe trips in Scotland, down the Spey, like I said, down the Wye on the border of Wales. I spent quite a lot of time just up the coast from you, near Weymouth. Got some friends that live up there, and it's just so beautiful around there. And where we are now in Scotland, so you know, I do think that kind of close to home. Yeah, it's so easy to sort of look at places like Alaska and think these are the last wildernesses we have, and kind of be a bit down on where we live. But it is, you know, we do live in a very special place, I think.
Did a teacher ever inspire you to write?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. Absolutely. I had two amazing English teachers. One when I was about 10 years old, called Mr. Hill. And then one when I was at secondary school, called Mr. Taylor. And yeah, I think they are the reason that I write, like 100%. And actually, when I published the book, it was very important to me to get back in touch with both of them, and say thanks, basically, you know, because and they were both very touched, as I imagine a teacher would be. But yeah, I think it's made me think about teaching a lot and where it comes from, because yeah, they are absolutely the reason that I'm writing today. Yeah.
Thank you.
Did you get the idea for writing the book before or after you chose to do the trip?
It was before it. So I'd gone to Alaska that first time, and found the story, sat in on that court case that I was talking about, and I wrote an article for a US magazine called Atlantic about it. And I wrote some other articles based on Alaska from that first trip. And that was when I sort of developed the idea of the book, of going down the Yukon. Yeah, kind of put the whole idea together. You know, you look at a map, and it is the obvious way to travel across the state. Like, it is this kind of blue line that it really makes you sort of want to follow. And it's kind of the only way to get around as well. Like I said, there's no roads, so to get to a lot of these remote villages, the river's frozen solid in winter. So then at that time, people are driving on it in snowmobiles, and then in the summer, when the river thaws, people are going down it in boats. So yeah, so I kind of conceived this whole idea, and then I was able to get a publisher interested who signed up and paid the book up front. So the whole way along, I was very much kind of thinking that I was writing a book. So that meant kind of taking a lot of notes, recording a lot of interviews, spending, you know, on top of the kind of, like, it was a lot of work, you know, like the just kind of living was a lot of work. Every night, sort of, we'd pull the canoe up the beach, put the tent up, make a fire, catch some fish, like cook dinner. You know, it was a sort of couple hours at the end, and then the beginning of the day just living. And then after you've done all that, then to sort of sit down and write up the day and do all that was something I hadn't really kind of factored in at the start. But yeah, I kind of felt like I was there to work, I suppose. I went with my girlfriend, and so that was a massive help, to have someone else that could kind of share the cooking and that kind of stuff, so that I could work in the evenings as well.
I think you kind of explained a bit, but what led to the book mainly focusing on the salmon and the journey of them?
Yeah, I mean, it's really because salmon are such an important part of the culture. You know, it's kind of an amazing place, because you know, we sort of think of like 1492 when Columbus first got to America as being like the time when all the indigenous cultures in America started changing. But in Alaska, it was so much later than that. You know, there was a few Russians had gone there in the 19th century. But it was basically 1896, which was when gold was discovered in Dawson City, right on the border of Alaska. I don't know if you've heard of the Klondike Gold Rush, which was sort of like this, just everyone went absolutely nuts for it. There's 100,000 people from all over the world suddenly turned up in this tiny little bush village, essentially, because they'd heard all these rumors that there were, you know, gold nuggets the size of people's fists just sit in the river. And most of it was nonsense. Like a few people got very rich and most people got absolutely nothing at all. But you imagine you've got all these, you know, indigenous groups who have basically never seen a white man and are living like completely traditional lives, kind of in skin tents and hunting muskrat. And they'd have these, yeah, their lives would be based around this kind of series of camps. They might sort of go somewhere that's like particularly good for hunting a moose in the autumn. They'd normally go up into the mountains for the winter because it was slightly less cold on higher ground. And then in the spring, they'd build these canoes out of birch bark and they'd drift back down the streams and come to the main body of the Yukon. And they'd get to the Yukon at the same time that the salmon were coming up it. Because the salmon was this like very reliable food source, you know, rather than having to kind of chase a moose or pick berries or anything like that. The salmon would come up the river at the same time every year. And all you had to do was put your net in and pull them out, basically. And then they would preserve the salmon, they'd smoke them, dry them, and that would be the food that would kind of keep them going through the whole year. And it was also this kind of very relaxing time because, you know, it was sunny 24 hours a day. It was kind of the time for families to come together, for the old people to pass down like their knowledge to the kids, for the kids to learn how to fish, for like the teenagers to flirt and get married and all that sort of stuff. And so even though there's been this like incredibly quick rate of change in Alaska, like I'd meet people in their kind of 80s and 90s that had grown up having that totally traditional lifestyle, who've now got an iPhone and they're keeping up with their great grandkids on their iPhone. You know, they've completely straddled worlds. But even though so much has changed now, and that idea of the fish camp and all going out as a family for those few weeks of the summer, that's still there. People still do that. It's kind of what people will do on their summer holidays, you know, take time off work and go and do that with the kids. So that part of the culture has stayed really strong. And that is now changing, you know, because the salmon numbers are now so much in decline. So the first village that I came to right at the top of the river is called Teslin. And because they're right at the top, they saw the changes that were happening to the fish before anyone else. And voluntarily, 20 years ago, they decided they were going to stop fishing just until the numbers got back up. But those numbers have never got back up. So you've got these young adults in the village that have never caught a fish, and they have to fly in their fish frozen now from somewhere else. And so you really start to see that culture starting to change. So I guess that was kind of why I decided to focus on the salmon, you know, and partly they are these incredible creatures, you know, that do these insane migrations. The Yukon is the longest salmon migration in the world. So these fish will, so their lives, we started the journey at a place called McNeil Lake, which is 1,996 miles from the mouth of the river. We had to get a float plane to get up there. And these salmon are born at the top of the river. They'll float down to the river. They'll spend their entire adult lives out in the ocean. And then the last few months of their lives, not eating or drinking, they'll swim up the river against the current to get to the exact same pool where they were born, navigating just by their sense of smell, to then, you know, lay the eggs for the next generation, and then we'll all just die and rot away before the next generation's born because they're so exhausted, essentially. So there was something kind of very poetic and moving in that. These First Nations people do see, you know, they are very much about kind of sacrificing for future generations as well. So there's something quite like poetic in the salmon story for them as well. and it was easy also to kind of draw parallels between what's happening to the salmon and what's happened to some of the indigenous people, and these like terrible abuses that they've suffered in the last 100 years. From missionaries turning up and trying to sort of convert them to Catholicism, missionaries turning up and taking their children away and sending their children to boarding school for 5 years to try and make them lose their native culture, basically. And that was happening up until the 1980s. And then just all the trauma that's led to, the alcoholism and the suicide and the domestic violence and all these things that, there's been this but throughout all of that, they've stayed really strong and proud as well and wanting to keep their culture. So, I mean, that's a long answer to your question, really. But basically, the salmon was just a way in to like really open up this story of this place, and kind of tell the story of the people. Yeah.
Well, then, considering the book is a lot about the meaning of the salmon that it projects, how significant was it seeing them for the first time after you had breakfast?
Yeah, it was amazing. I mean, there was something quite strange in. I saw a lot of dead salmon before I saw a live one. We were going down. So yeah, we started at this lake at the beginning of May, and that was about the same time that the salmon were entering the mouth of the river. So the whole way we were going down and they were coming up, and we were seeing people kind of getting their fishing nets ready, getting their smoke houses ready, getting their fish wheels ready, which are these kind of amazing, look almost like kind of fairground rides that sort of rotate in the river and kind of scoop out salmon in their baskets, powered by the speed of the current. So everyone was kind of getting very excited about the salmon coming, and then the Yukon is so full of mud, full of silt, that you can't see anything. If you put your finger in, as soon as you get your finger in, you can't see like the first knuckle once you put it in. It's just brown. So we knew that these salmon were kind of swimming up the river under us, but we couldn't see any at all. But suddenly we were seeing people catching fish. We were seeing, we were seeing the smokehouses being full. And there was something quite strange about researching this fish that was kind of massively in decline, but then eating it a lot as well. But every single time you turn up somewhere, they're going to cook fish and they want to share their fish with you, and that's what hospitality kind of is for people. So we ended up eating a lot of really amazing fish, just so oily and delicious and good. But actually, by the end of the journey, I still hadn't seen a king salmon. We'd seen some other types of salmon, but we still hadn't seen a king salmon. So then I went out. Once the journey had finished, we went up this kind of creek quite near where we were to try and find them for the first time. And we found someone kind of right at the end of their lives, just before they were about to die, really, after they laid their eggs. And having learned so much about them, and also having learned the ones that actually come back to lay their eggs have won a lottery, really. Out of some of the really big salmon will lay about 20,000 eggs, and they're doing well if they maybe get 5 babies come back. So that's sort of, I don't know, what's that, like 0.01% of salmon eggs will actually reach adulthood and come back to reproduce, because of predators and disease and overfishing and climate change and killer whales and otters, and everything wants to have a piece of the salmon. So when you see the ones that have come back and they've actually, they've run that gauntlet and they've survived all that, yeah, there's something quite moving in that as well. And it's so, it's a fish. Like, who cares about a fish? Like, they're not at all the most sort of, they're a hard seller fish. Like, we can get excited about a tiger or a wolf or something like that. It's kind of hard to feel an emotion for a fish. But I definitely had this sort of huge sense of respect for them by the end, like knowing kind of these incredible journeys that they've been on.
So would you say that you take your philosophies of environmentalism and public land from the nature?
Sorry, can you say that again?
So would you say that you take like some of the philosophies such as like public land and environmentalism from nature, such as the salmon, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, that idea of kind of sacrificing yourself for future generations, which is kind of that sort of indigenous belief. I mean, not sacrificing, but that sense of, we look at, there's quite a kind of common indigenous viewpoint, which is you think about the 7 generations that come after you, and your actions are meant to, look that far forward. And I think there's definitely something to be learned in that. I think both the ways that we live and also our political systems are kind of very short term, and thinking 7 generations down the line is a much more inspiring way to live, I think. There was also something in the ways that a lot of the First Nations in Canada are almost, each village is allowed to make their own decisions in the ways that they govern themselves. So they don't have this kind of big government run by the sort of federal government in Canada. Each village is making its own decisions. And they're making much better decisions about how to protect the environment than across the border in America, in Alaska, where all the decisions are getting sent from kind of state and federal level. We get given this idea by our governments that we can't make good decisions for ourselves, that we need the governments to kind of make our decisions for us. But actually, in this example, when people got to manage their own resources, they were doing it much better than when they were being kind of told from the top by people that didn't really know what they were talking about. So I think there was something, being in control of your resources and seeing land not as like a private ownership, but something that you kind of live on and respect, is really important. And when land is kind of private property, then and it's all just about dividing up and I think there's a much more sort of sympathetic way of living on the land there, I suppose. Which is not to say it's perfect, I mean, they're also sort of Americans, Canadians, they use as much carbon, burn for as much carbon as we do in many ways. But there's a different mentality, I think.
We got about 10 minutes left, so Reese has got a couple of questions.
Right.
I don't think the parents will be happy if I keep them past the bell, but this is amazing. We're all really interested, so thank you. But Reese,
what helps to inspire you when you're writing? For example, do you listen to music when you write?
Yeah, I always listen to music when I write, as long as it hasn't got words in it. Basically, that seems to be the. I go through different phases, but quite a lot of electronic music. But yeah, something to kind of stop my mind wandering off. But I'll generally write with headphones, yeah. Especially because I've now got 2 little kids in the house as well, so it's quite good to close myself off.
How much did you write on the trip, or did you write it all after the trip?
I did all the. Yeah, I mean, I'd write every night. I did a lot of writing in the canoe, actually. Turns out you can get notebooks that have waterproof pages, so that was quite important, and I'd do a lot of writing sitting in the canoe as well. And I find when I write that it's really important to just get everything down as quickly as possible. Like a lot of the detail, if I've met someone, a lot of that or seen something, that kind of initial detail, it feels really important to get down as quickly as possible, because that's the sort of stuff that you forget when you get back home. So I came back with pages and pages and pages of notes that I then sort of spent the next year working into a book. But yeah, I think that writing that you do in the kind of the immediate, as soon as you can get it down, is kind of some of the best stuff, really.
Would you ever go on the journey again?
Yeah, I'd love to. And one thing that I felt about the book, it's hard when you write something like this that you kind of you're kind of just taking, like you're going down the river and you're taking all these stories of all these people, and and then I'm turning it into something that I'm going to make money out of. whereas it you know, the stories kind of belong to the people that I've taken them from, really. And I did post a book to every village that I went to the sort of tribal office. So there is a copy of the book in every village. But it would have been lovely to sort of go back down the river and kind of talk to people and sort of give the book to people and see what it means to people and kind of give back in a certain way, you know. Like, I do hope that the book in a way is able to give back, like, you know, because just and to sort of show people this kind of bigger picture of some of the things that can be done to try and save the salmon, because it's not too late. But it was also a very complicated journey to do. It was quite an expensive journey to do, and so and I do now have a baby, so like at some point in the future, I would love to go back, maybe to see how things have changed a bit further down the line. And I made a lot of good friends there as well, you know, who it would be really nice to go and see again. So yeah. One day.
Any closing questions, boys, or you? No. All good. And thank you very much for joining us.